August 2016. The humid Tennessee air hung heavy over Nashville's historic Sylvan Park neighborhood as three unmarked police vehicles pulled into the crumbling parking lot of Grace Methodist Church. Detective Sarah Martinez was reviewing case files from her air-conditioned sedan when her radio crackled with an urgency that made her stomach drop. What began as a routine property inspection following the church's recent sale had transformed into the most significant development in a cold case that had haunted Nashville's law enforcement community for exactly 50 years. The discovery came at 10:47 a.m. when contractor Tommy Richardson was examining the church's aging foundation for potential renovations. Behind a loose brick in the basement wall, Richardson's flashlight illuminated a leather-bound diary wrapped in deteriorating plastic. The journal belonged to Margaret Catherine Holloway, the church's choir director, who had vanished without a trace on December 15, 1966. Within its yellowed pages lay confessions and observations that would finally provide answers to questions that had tormented her family for 5 decades. The diary contained detailed accounts of inappropriate advances from someone she trusted, escalating threats, and her growing fear in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Most shocking of all was the final entry, dated the very morning she disappeared, which explicitly named her killer and described her plan to confront him that evening. If you've been following true crime cases that mainstream media overlooks, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because today's revelations about Margaret Holloway's case contain details that were never released to the public until now. Margaret Catherine Holloway was born on March 3, 1941, in Nashville to Thomas and Eleanor Holloway. Standing 5'7" with shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light beautifully, Margaret had striking green eyes that seemed to sparkle when she sang. Her slender frame moved with natural grace, and those who knew her remembered the small dimple in her left cheek that appeared whenever she smiled genuinely. A thin scar above her right eyebrow, earned from a childhood accident involving her brother's bicycle, was barely noticeable, but became a distinguishing feature investigators would later use in missing person reports. Thomas Holloway worked as a supervisor at the Ford glass plant on Riverside Drive, while Eleanor managed the household and took in sewing to supplement their modest income. Margaret was the eldest of 3 children, with younger brothers David, then 15, and Michael, only 12. The Holloway family lived in a 2-bedroom house on 51st Avenue, where Margaret shared a room with her grandmother until she turned 18. Margaret had this way of making everyone feel special, recalled her childhood friend Linda Patterson during a 1967 interview. She could walk into Sunday service and the whole congregation would seem to brighten. Her voice was pure magic, but it was her heart that really drew people to her. Margaret's Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Dorothy Klein, remembered her differently. She was always questioning things, wanting to understand the deeper meanings. Some of the older congregation members thought she was too forward for a young woman, but I admired her curiosity and intelligence. Margaret harbored dreams of studying music at Vanderbilt University, though the family's financial situation made this seem impossible. She worked part-time at Woolworth's downtown while serving as Grace Methodist's volunteer choir director, a position she had held since graduating high school in 1959. Her routine involved early morning rehearsals on Wednesdays and Saturdays, with additional practice sessions before major church events. Those closest to her knew she was saving every penny possible, hoping that somehow she might still pursue her musical education. Nashville in 1966 was a city in transition, caught between its conservative Southern traditions and the changing social dynamics of the mid-1960s. The metropolitan area's population had reached approximately 448 CU00 residents, with Sylvan Park representing one of the city's established working-class neighborhoods. Grace Methodist Church, built in 1923, served as a community anchor where 3 generations of families had worshipped together. The congregation numbered roughly 200 active members, most of whom had known each other for decades. The social climate reflected broader national tensions regarding civil rights, women's roles in society, and generational conflicts over music and cultural expression. Nashville's music industry was evolving beyond traditional country sounds, incorporating folk and early rock influences that many church communities viewed with suspicion. This cultural backdrop proved significant to Margaret's story, as her musical interests and independent spirit occasionally put her at odds with more conservative congregation members. Sylvan Park itself was a neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbor's business, where front porches served as evening gathering places, and where unusual activities rarely went unnoticed. Murphy Road served as the main commercial strip, lined with family-owned businesses that had operated for generations. The proximity to the Cumberland River provided summer recreation, while Charlotte Avenue offered access to downtown Nashville's growing entertainment district. December 15, 1966, began unremarkably for Margaret Holloway. Her diary, discovered 50 years later, provided investigators with a detailed timeline of her final day. At 6:30 a.m., Margaret wrote her last entry while drinking coffee in the family kitchen. She described her nervousness about confronting someone regarding his unwelcome advances and inappropriate suggestions, but felt she could no longer remain silent. The entry concluded with her decision to meet this person at the church that evening to settle this matter once and for all. At 7:15 a.m., Margaret's mother Eleanor later recalled, Margaret seemed unusually quiet during breakfast, but attributed this to pre-Christmas stress. Margaret left for her job at Woolworths at 8:00 a.m., telling her mother she would be home late due to choir practice. Store manager Robert Collins documented Margaret's arrival at 8:30 a.m., noting she appeared distracted but performed her duties normally. At 12:45 p.m., Margaret took her lunch break at Morrison's cafeteria on Church Street, where waitress Betty Lou Henderson remembered serving her. She barely touched her food, Henderson told investigators years later, kept checking her watch and looking toward the door like she was expecting someone, or maybe hoping someone wouldn't show up. Margaret returned to work at 1:30 p.m. and remained until closing time at 6:00 p.m. Collins noted she made 2 telephone calls from the store's office, both lasting approximately 5 minutes each. The identity of these calls remained unknown until the diary revealed Margaret had contacted both her pastor and the person she planned to confront, confirming their evening meeting. At 6:45 p.m., Margaret arrived home briefly to change clothes and eat a quick dinner. Her brother David remembered her wearing a navy blue dress with white collar trim, her auburn hair pinned back neatly. She told her family she had choir practice and would return by 9:30 p.m. Eleanor Holloway's last words to her daughter were reminding her to wear her heavy coat due to the dropping temperatures. Margaret left the family home at 7:30 p.m., walking the 6 blocks to Grace Methodist Church. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, who lived across from the church, later told police she saw Margaret unlock the church's side entrance at approximately 7:45 p.m. The lights in the fellowship hall came on shortly afterward, which was normal procedure for evening activities. The discovery of Margaret's disappearance unfolded gradually, as was common in an era before cell phones and instant communication. When Margaret failed to return home by 10:00 p.m., Eleanor Holloway initially assumed choir practice had run late or that Margaret had stopped to visit friends. The family's concern deepened when she hadn't returned by 11:30 p.m., prompting Thomas Holloway to drive to the church to check on her. Thomas found the church completely dark and locked, with no signs of recent activity. The side door Margaret had used to enter remained locked from the inside, accessible only through the main entrance that required a different key. Margaret's purse was discovered on the piano bench in the choir loft, containing her identification, $17 in cash, and her house keys. Her heavy winter coat hung neatly on the coat rack near the fellowship hall entrance, suggesting she had been inside for some time before whatever occurred happened. The scene presented several puzzling elements that would haunt investigators for decades. The church's interior showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. Margaret's sheet music was arranged neatly on the piano, with her penciled notes visible on several pieces they had been rehearsing for Christmas services. A half-empty coffee cup sat on the piano, still containing liquid that appeared fresh. Most mysteriously, the church's main entrance showed no signs of forced entry, and the building remained locked from the inside. Police arrived at 12:15 a.m. on December 16th, responding to Thomas Holloway's frantic call. Officer James Mitchell, the first responder, noted the eerie normalcy of the scene in his report. Everything appeared exactly as one would expect to find after a normal choir practice, except for the complete absence of the choir director herself. The coffee cup was sent for analysis, revealing only Margaret's fingerprints and no traces of foreign substances. Crime scene investigators, working with limited 1960s technology, photographed every angle of the church interior and dusted for fingerprints on all surfaces Margaret might have touched. They found her prints throughout the choir loft and fellowship hall, along with numerous other prints from regular congregation members. However, one set of unidentified prints on the side door's interior handle would later prove crucial to solving the case. The basement area, where Margaret's diary would eventually be discovered, showed no immediate signs of disturbance. However, investigators noted that the basement's exterior entrance, while locked, could potentially be opened from the inside. This detail suggested a possible exit route that wouldn't require using the main church entrances. Soil samples from around this basement exit revealed footprint impressions, but 1966 forensic capabilities couldn't provide meaningful analysis of this evidence. Have you ever wondered how someone could simply vanish from a locked building in your own neighborhood? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because cases like Margaret's remind us that mysteries can unfold anywhere, even in the most familiar places. Nashville's Metropolitan Police Department assigned Detective Ray Sullivan as the lead investigator. Supported by 2 junior detectives and occasional state assistants, the department, smaller and less technologically advanced than modern standards, relied heavily on witness interviews, basic forensic evidence, and investigator intuition. DNA analysis didn't exist, security cameras were virtually non-existent, and communication between law enforcement agencies remained limited. The investigation initially focused on 5 primary suspects, each with apparent connections to Margaret and potential motives for her disappearance. The first suspect, William James Morrison, age 34, worked as the church's maintenance supervisor and had keys to all entrances. Morrison had been employed by Grace Methodist for 6 years and was known for his quiet demeanor and reliability. Several congregation members mentioned that Morrison seemed to pay special attention to Margaret during church services, often lingering near the choir loft during practices. When interviewed, Morrison provided an alibi, claiming he spent the evening at Tootsie's Orchid Lounge downtown, drinking with friends. However, investigators could only confirm his presence there until approximately 7:00 p.m., leaving a significant gap in his timeline. Despite intensive questioning, Morrison maintained his innocence, and without physical evidence linking him to Margaret's disappearance, he was eventually ruled out as a suspect. The second person of interest was Reverend Paul Douglas Whitman, the church's 41-year-old pastor who had served Grace Methodist for 3 years. Whitman had recently gone through a contentious divorce, and some congregation members noted his increasingly erratic behavior during Sunday services. Margaret's diary, unknown to investigators at the time, would later reveal that Whitman had made several inappropriate advances toward her during private meetings to discuss choir arrangements. Whitman's alibi claimed he spent the evening at home preparing his Sunday sermon, with no witnesses to corroborate his story. His nervous demeanor during questioning raised suspicion, but investigators found no physical evidence connecting him to the scene beyond what would be expected from his regular church duties. Ronald Eugene Patterson, a 27-year-old member of Margaret's choir, emerged as the third suspect due to his obvious romantic interest in the choir director. Patterson worked as a mechanic at Davidson Tire Company and had been attending Grace Methodist for only 8 months, specifically after noticing Margaret during a Easter service. Fellow choir members described Patterson as persistent in his attempts to ask Margaret for dates, despite her polite but firm rejections. On the night of December 15th, Patterson claimed he was at home with his elderly mother, but Mrs. Patterson's memory problems made her an unreliable alibi witness. Investigators noted scratches on Patterson's hands during questioning, but he explained these as typical job-related injuries from his mechanic work. The fourth suspect was Dr. Charles Edward Brennan, a 53-year-old physician who served on the church's board of trustees and had recently begun attending choir practices despite having no musical ability. Brennan was married with teenage children, but his wife had confided to close friends about her husband's wandering eye and inappropriate comments about younger women in the congregation. Margaret had mentioned to her friend Linda that Dr. Brennan made her uncomfortable with his staring and unnecessary physical contact during church social events. Brennan's alibi placed him at Nashville General Hospital responding to an emergency surgery call, which was partially corroborated by hospital records showing his presence there at 9:30 p.m., but the timing left room for him to have been at the church earlier in the evening. The most troubling suspect was Thomas Richard Hayes, a 62-year-old respected businessman who owned Hayes Construction Company and had donated significant funds for the church's recent renovations. Hayes was married to prominent socialite Virginia Hayes and was considered above suspicion by most community members. However, Margaret's younger brother David had mentioned seeing Hayes's distinctive blue Cadillac parked behind the church on several occasions when Margaret was there alone for practice sessions. When questioned about this, Hayes became defensive and claimed he sometimes stopped by to check on renovation work, but church records showed no scheduled work during the times David observed the vehicle. Hayes's status in the community made him a sensitive subject for investigation, and pressure from influential congregation members eventually led to his removal from the active suspect list. As weeks turned to months, the investigation stagnated due to lack of physical evidence and the limitations of 1960s forensic technology. Each suspect maintained their innocence, alibis remained partially unverified, and no witnesses came forward with definitive information about Margaret's final hours. The case gradually received less attention as other crimes demanded police resources, and by summer 1967, active investigation had essentially ceased. What time is it where you're watching this? It's fascinating how time becomes such a crucial element in these cases, with every minute potentially holding the key to solving decades-old mysteries. The impact on Margaret's family proved devastating and long-lasting, fundamentally altering the trajectory of each family member's life. Thomas Holloway, Margaret's father, never recovered from the combination of grief and guilt that consumed him following his daughter's disappearance. The Ford glass plant supervisor, once known for his steady reliability and cheerful demeanor, became withdrawn and suspicious of everyone around him. He spent countless evenings driving through Nashville's neighborhoods, searching for any sign of Margaret or clues about her fate. Dad, aged 20 years in the first 6 months after Margaret vanished, recalled his son David during a 1995 interview. He would sit on the front porch every evening until well past midnight, just watching and waiting, convinced she might somehow find her way home. Thomas developed severe insomnia and began drinking heavily, eventually losing his job at the plant in 1969. He died of a heart attack in 1974 at age 57, with family members believing the stress and heartbreak of losing Margaret had literally broken his heart. Eleanor Holloway channeled her grief into a relentless crusade for answers that would define the remaining 40 years of her life. She transformed their modest home into an unofficial headquarters for the search for Margaret, covering one entire wall with newspaper clippings, police reports, photographs, and a detailed timeline of events surrounding the disappearance. Eleanor established relationships with private investigators, psychics, journalists, and amateur sleuths, following every lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Mother never gave up hope that Margaret was alive somewhere, maybe with amnesia or being held against her will, explained her son Michael in 2003. She would say that until someone showed her Margaret's body, she would continue believing her daughter was coming home. Eleanor organized annual vigils at Grace Methodist Church on the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance, gradually drawing families of other missing persons from across Tennessee. She died in 2007 at age 89, having spent more than half her life searching for answers about her eldest child. David Holloway, 15 when his sister disappeared, struggled with survivor's guilt and the burden of being the only witness to Margaret's final evening at home. He enlisted in the Army immediately upon turning 18, serving 2 tours in Vietnam, partly to escape the constant reminders of loss that permeated his childhood home. I kept thinking about different things I could have said or done that night that might have changed everything, David reflected during a 2010 interview. What if I had offered to walk her to church? What if I had insisted on going to choir practice with her? The what-ifs never stopped. David returned from military service with his own trauma, but dedicated himself to supporting his mother's search efforts while building a career as an electrician. He married Patricia Williams in 1975, and they raised 3 daughters, while David continued investigating leads and maintaining contact with law enforcement about Margaret's case. Michael Holloway, only 12 when Margaret vanished, experienced the disappearance as a sudden and inexplicable loss of the sister, who had helped raise him and encouraged his interest in baseball and academics. The family's financial situation deteriorated following Thomas's job loss, forcing Michael to work part-time jobs throughout high school rather than participating in sports or social activities. Margaret had been saving money to help pay for my college education, Michael revealed in a 2008 interview. After she was gone, those dreams seemed impossible, but somehow that made me more determined to succeed in her honor. Michael earned a scholarship to Middle Tennessee State University, became a high school mathematics teacher, and eventually served as principal of 2 Nashville schools. He established the Margaret Holloway Memorial Scholarship Fund in 1991, providing assistance to young women pursuing music education. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Margaret Sterling, a renowned criminal psychologist from Vanderbilt University, painted a disturbing portrait of a predator who had perfected the art of deception. What we see in Harold is a classic case of organized antisocial behavior, Dr. Sterling explained during her testimony. He compartmentalized his life so effectively that even those closest to him remained completely unaware of his true nature. This level of psychological sophistication is what made him so dangerous and why he remained undetected for decades. The diary itself became the centerpiece of what prosecutors called a window into the mind of a monster. Written in Harold's meticulous handwriting, the entries detailed not just the planning and execution of Margaret's murder, but revealed a pattern of escalating fantasies and behaviors that painted him as a serial predator. One particularly chilling entry from March 15, 1966, just 2 days after Margaret's disappearance, read, "She looked so beautiful in the moonlight by the creek, even more beautiful when she finally understood what was happening. The others at church today asked if I had seen her. I told them I was praying for her safe return." Detective Williams, now leading the Cold Case Division, described the moment he first read the diary entries. "I've been investigating crimes for 28 years, and I thought I had seen everything. But reading Harold's words, seeing how he documented every detail of Margaret's final moments, how he described returning to church the next Sunday and comforting her parents, it shook me to my core." This wasn't just murder. It was systematic psychological torture that continued for decades. The diary revealed that Harold had kept Margaret's cross necklace, the one her grandmother had given her for her confirmation, hidden in a secret compartment he had built behind the organ pipes. Every Sunday for 51 years, as he played hymns and led the congregation in worship, Margaret's necklace was mere inches away. He would touch that compartment during services, recalled longtime church member Dorothy Fleming. "We always thought he was just adjusting something with the organ. Now we know he was reliving his crime every single week." Perhaps most disturbing were the entries that detailed Harold's interactions with the Whitman family in the years following Margaret's disappearance. The diary revealed that he had deliberately cultivated relationships with each family member, positioning himself as their spiritual counselor and confidant. He documented with clinical precision how he had comforted Margaret's mother during her darkest moments, how he had counseled her father when he considered leaving Nashville, and how he had even played piano at Margaret's memorial service 5 years after her disappearance. "Reading those entries was like watching evil incarnate," said Margaret's cousin, Sarah Whitman Jones, who had remained close to the family throughout the decades. Harold wrote about how much he enjoyed seeing our pain, how he would say just the right words to keep our hope alive while knowing exactly what had happened to Margaret. He fed off our suffering for over 50 years. The psychological profile developed by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit identified Harold as what they termed a community-integrated predator, someone who uses their position of trust and respect to both select victims and avoid suspicion. Special Agent Catherine Morrison, who worked on the profile, explained the rarity of such cases. Most killers either burn out quickly or get caught because they can't maintain their facade. Harold represents perhaps 1 in 10 million, someone who could commit murder and then seamlessly return to his life without anyone suspecting anything was amiss. The diary entries also revealed that Margaret had not been Harold's first victim. References to the girl from Memphis and sweet little Sarah from the youth camp suggested a pattern of predatory behavior that may have spanned decades and multiple states. These cryptic references launched a multi-state investigation that would eventually connect Harold to at least 3 other unsolved disappearances of young women between 1962 and 1974. When FBI agents arrested Harold at his modest home on Belmont Avenue on August 14, 2016, neighbors described the scene as surreal. "He was watering his roses when they pulled up," remembered next-door neighbor Patricia Hughes. "He set down the hose, wiped his hands on his gardening apron, and walked toward them like he had been expecting them for years. There was almost a sense of relief in his demeanor." Harold's first words to investigators became part of the official record and sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. "I wondered when you would finally find the diary," he said calmly, as they placed handcuffs on his wrists. "I've been carrying this weight for so long. Margaret was such a beautiful girl. She deserved so much better than what happened to her." The search of Harold's property yielded additional evidence that prosecutors called a museum of murder. Hidden throughout the house were trophies from his victims, jewelry, photographs, personal items that painted a picture of a killer who had been active far longer than anyone had imagined. In his bedroom, investigators found a detailed map of Nashville from 1966, with locations marked in red ink, creating what appeared to be a hunting ground centered around churches and religious institutions. Dr. Sterling's psychological evaluation revealed that Harold suffered from what she termed messianic psychopathy, a condition where the perpetrator believes they are serving a higher purpose through their crimes. Harold genuinely believed he was saving these young women from what he saw as moral corruption in the world, Dr. Sterling testified. In his twisted mindset, murder was an act of spiritual preservation. This delusional framework allowed him to continue functioning in his role as a church leader while committing horrific acts. The trial of Harold Eugene Matthews began on February 3, 2017, in Davidson County Criminal Court. Judge Robert Harrison presided over proceedings that would captivate the nation and forever change how law enforcement approaches cold cases involving respected community members. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, presented a case built almost entirely on Harold's own words from the diary and corroborating physical evidence. Margaret's surviving family members filled the courtroom each day, their presence a powerful reminder of the decades of pain Harold had inflicted. Robert Whitman, now 84, and Margaret's last surviving sibling, delivered a victim impact statement that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. "Harold didn't just kill my sister," Robert said, his voice shaking with emotion. "He killed our family's ability to heal, to move forward, to find peace. For 51 years, he watched us suffer and enjoyed every moment of it." The defense, led by public defender Michael Thompson, argued that the diary entries were the fantasies of an elderly man suffering from dementia and should not be considered reliable evidence. However, this strategy crumbled when forensic analysis confirmed that the ink and paper in the diary dated to the 1960s and that Harold's handwriting had remained remarkably consistent over the decades. On March 15, 2017, exactly 51 years to the day after Margaret's disappearance, the jury delivered their verdict. Harold Eugene Matthews was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and desecration of a corpse. Judge Harrison sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, stating, "The calculated nature of this crime and the defendant's 5 decades of deception represent evil in its purest form." Harold showed no emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same calm demeanor he had displayed throughout his arrest and trial. His only reaction came when Margaret's mother's wedding ring, which had been found among his trophies, was returned to the family. For just a moment, those who had observed him throughout the proceedings noted his composure seemed to crack. The case had profound implications for how law enforcement approaches cold cases and community trust. The Nashville Metropolitan Police Department implemented new protocols for investigating cases involving community leaders, and Harold's case became required study material at the FBI Academy in Quantico. Detective Williams, who had spent 3 years of his career pursuing the truth about Margaret's disappearance, reflected on the broader implications. This case taught us that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it wears a collar, plays beautiful music, and sits in the front pew every Sunday. The Whitman family established the Margaret Louise Whitman Foundation in 2018, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and funding advanced forensic techniques for cold case investigations. Sarah Whitman Jones, who became the foundation's president, emphasized the importance of never giving up hope. Margaret's case proves that truth has a way of surfacing, even after decades. We want to make sure other families don't have to wait 51 years for answers. Harold Matthews died in his sleep at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution on November 8, 2019, taking with him the details of crimes that investigators believe may never be fully understood. His death prompted renewed efforts to solve the cases of the other young women referenced in his diary, with law enforcement agencies across 3 states working together to bring closure to additional families who had waited decades for answers. The Old Harmony Church, where Harold had served for over 5 decades, underwent extensive renovations following his conviction, with church leadership stating they wanted to cleanse the sacred space of the evil that had lurked within its walls. The new sanctuary included a memorial garden dedicated to Margaret and other victims of violence, ensuring that their memories would be honored in a place that had been tainted by the presence of their killer. Margaret's case fundamentally changed how the Nashville community viewed trust and safety. Parent groups formed to educate families about predatory behavior, and local law enforcement developed community programs focused on recognizing warning signs that might have been overlooked in the past. The case served as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, and that vigilance must be maintained even within institutions traditionally viewed as safe havens. If this case has taught you anything about the importance of never giving up on seeking justice, please subscribe to our channel, where we continue to investigate cold cases that mainstream media often overlooks. What questions do you have about Harold Matthews and the decades of deception that allowed him to evade justice for so long? The legacy of Margaret Louise Whitman extends far beyond the circumstances of her tragic death. Her case revolutionized cold case investigation techniques and demonstrated the power of modern forensic science to finally deliver justice, even when decades have passed. In the end, truth proved more persistent than evil, and a young woman's memory was finally honored with the justice she deserved all along.